I want to touch three questions. Um, First question, is this change for real? Secondly, what's it mean for Russian governance? And thirdly, what are the implications for those of us on the outside? Now, let me start with whether this change really is significant, permanent, real, whatever adjective you want to put after the verb. And my short answer is it is. It is quite profound. It is setting Russia onto a new phase, and the trajectory which it's going to take is really as yet to be determined. And so we can all speculate, but the reality is nobody knows quite where it's going. Now, why is it a change this time and it might not have been in the previous two electoral cycles or political cycles? I think there are two or three reasons. One is what's going on over the last several months reflects some key trends that have been building in the Russian Federation over the last several years. First of those is citizen activism. If you go back to even the beginnings of when the effort to change the old Soviet system of privileges to monetary payments, you had a reaction from the public. You had all sorts of pensioners out in the streets blocking highways around Moscow and across the country. And the government basically didn't know what to do, and they backed down. They had to rethink it. And you've had a series of activities like that over the last several years that run from the creation of a drivers' movement in response to an egregious action by the police in the traffic accident case, to efforts to prevent the import of Japanese used automobiles. None of these was political particularly. They were all designed and arose when people got fed up with arbitrary bureaucratic action that affected their daily lives and the way they lived. So what happened in the last few months? Why this sudden change? Well, I put it as it's sort of a perfect storm. That movement of citizen activism and the sort of tradition now of mobilizing when you were abused or when you felt wronged got connected with the electoral process. And it came out during the parliamentary elections, the elections for the Duma, when people felt that in a very graphic and visual way that was shown by cell phone pictures and everything else, the system was denying them a voice, and they just had enough. And you got the beginning then of this activist demonstrations. All of you know what then followed. It had certain effects. Mr. Putin had to campaign for the first time ever. You had some real politics begin of different people getting actually elected without the support or the acquiescence of the government. So that these changes are out there and they're important. The second point, I think, is that this reflects also the emergence in public life or in citizen life of a new group of people, and my colleague Wayne's going to talk about that. And I would only say that it's a group of people who probably have one thing in common. They really don't want 6 to 12 more years of the same thing they had for the last 12. And it may not be a lot more coherent than that right now, but I think that's what they're saying. The second point I would make is that this is real for another reason, and that is that the electoral process this time and its outcomes demonstrated that the system that Mr. Putin and his colleagues and Mr. Medvedev had counted on to run the system and govern doesn't work. Everybody in the parliament elections that I talked to expected that the United Russia people were going to lose votes, that it wasn't going to be the 2/3 control. They did not expect that they wouldn't get 50%. And that was a real shock. because they did all the things you do when you were running that system and it didn't perform. And so on December 5th, as Mr. Putin sort of got up in the morning, he had a system that didn't work anymore. And you had to begin to figure out, what do you do about that? How do you adjust? How did you manage when suddenly everything that you counted on making the system work for you didn't produce the results you needed? And that's the situation that happened over the last period. That is not going to change, and the genie's out of the bottle. I think the third point is that because it didn't work, it also has given rise to a new fluidity, a new uncertainty about who's in charge. You have new political actors. It's also pretty clear that the cast of characters in the presidential election just isn't going to be the same anymore. I mean, Zyuganov ran for president when I was there. So it's just not going to keep going on. But what we don't know is who's behind them. Those parties that they represented elected more people to the parliament. There is another generation of those political people coming along. And what their aspirations are going to be, and what the aspirations of others who are now talking about forming parties, like Mr. Prokhorov, we don't know. But there are clearly elements of the society which are very substantial that do not feel represented in the former system. And they're now demanding a voice. And I don't think that's going to change either. So these three things, it seemed to me, are new, and they are not going to be changed, and it means that the system's change over the last several months is profound. Second, very briefly, is what's it mean for governing Russia? Well, I think it means two things. Mr. Putin is going to have to preside when he gets inaugurated with his prime minister over a government that is not seen as having legitimacy. It's going to have to earn back the consent of the governed. My friend Dmitry Trenin from Moscow, who works with us, said that the key thing that all of this should be understood to mean is that the authoritarian system with the consent of the governed changed because the consent was withdrawn. And so how do they get it back? There are all kinds of reasons it's going to be difficult, and that there are many variations, but one fact is there, and that is that Mr. Putin cannot use the same system he did before of using unused assets and a huge rise in oil prices to create a system of growth for 7, 8, 9% a year. It's just not going to happen. So, in a sense, making life better as the path to legitimacy, to me, is probably not a viable way to go. So what's he going to have as his options? I think there are basically two he probably has in front of him. One is to open the political space, try to bring more people in, create a new legitimacy by creating a new constellation of political elements that make up the governing elite. And those people who have felt excluded, at least in its part. There are some signs that he's making gestures in that direction. Mr. Ryzhkov is going to be able to form a political party. We're going to elect governors. There are people being elected to office that are not United Russia. Well, maybe. We'll see. The other alternative is to try to reassert control. Bring back, if you will, legitimacy sort of by enforcing unity. Crack down on the press, try to control the internet, all of these things. I have my great doubts that's doable, frankly. But it doesn't mean that there won't be those who will try it, or who will think that it's a necessary key element to reasserting authority. My personal guess is we'll see a combination. Bring in some new people, not let demonstrations get out of hand, and so forth. The final question is sort of what are the implications of all this for the outsiders? What should we take away from this? What's a sensible posture for people who fundamentally believe in human rights and human dignity and the right of people to have a say in the way they're governed? Well, it seems to me that we ought to take very seriously the fact that Russian citizens themselves now have decided they're going to change their system. We don't know how they're going to do that. And they're probably not going to listen to us about how they do it. But they have at least done everything from raise money to show their willingness to participate in the political process in new ways, such that I think the idea that the outsiders are going to shape what Russia turns out to be or have a role in it ought to be taken with a great degree of modesty. The question of what we should be doing, it seems to me, is we ought to be finding creative ways and intelligent ways to encourage the better instincts. That we should be supporting those kinds of people, activities, if you will, the activities of civil society in the very broadest sense of the word, and the growth of it in ways that are effective with the people themselves. So, if this is a middle-class group, a property-owning group, then perhaps, ensuring that we worked with the private sector effectively and so forth is a way to go. If it is a group that is looking for rule of law, then trying to work in effective ways to improve the judicial system, perhaps, is a sensible way to go. What we need to do, though, it seems to me, is do those things which Russians themselves are prepared to say we want to see done and we need to have support. And by Russians themselves, I mean that seem to reflect true political authority. So here I would say we should stay engaged. We should make clear what our values are, what we stand for. And we should be willing to support those who are, in fact, building the new creative class, if you will, the agent of change that is going to make the difference. I have my great doubts about active involvement in their political process. I think it's probably not going to be very productive. On the other hand, indirectly supporting those dimensions of the change that are positive, I think, is what we ought to be about. So I'll stop there and give